Hello everybody, it is Drop Table here. I wanted to sit down and spend a couple of minutes talking about something that breaks my poor, fragile little gamer heart, and that is the Resident Evil series. Now, recently Capcom has released Resident Evil Remaster, which is a great game. I'm not going to detract from that, and obviously, it is a re-release of Resident Evil on the GameCube, which in itself was a re-release of Resident Evil on the PlayStation, so it's a re-release of a re-release. All that aside, however, it is a good game, and it is incredible to see Capcom actually giving the old school style of Resident Evil play some attention, because that's something that personally I have been begging for years. And when I was playing through Resident Evil Remaster, I really started to think about the Resident Evil series and really where it got off track, I guess is the best way to put it. Now, I'm not one of those old curmudgeons that's going to say, oh, Resident Evil 4 was a terrible game. You weren't fighting zombies, blah, blah, blah. That argument's been had, and that's been said a million times. What I will say, however, is that Resident Evil 4, while it was a very entertaining and fun game, and I beat it several times, had almost nothing to do with the Resident Evil series. Now, you got to remember at this point in time, all of the Resident Evil games, with the exception of Code Veronica, had taken place in or near Raccoon City. So now you're going to take Leon and send him to Spain and fight not zombies? These are some pretty interesting decisions that, even at the time, while I was enjoying it, never really made sense to me. What does this have to do with the Resident Evil series? And I'll tell you right now, not much. You had some of the same characters, and the game was called Resident Evil 4. And that was about it. Now, Resident Evil 4 was a good game. Let's talk about some that weren't so good. Now, we're not going to get into Outbreak and all those, because, technically I don't consider those to be part of the main canon. Resident Evil 5 was technically not a bad game, because essentially it was a carbon copy of the combat from Resident Evil 4. They took what they knew worked, and they redid it. But I beat that game probably 4 or 5 times, and the only thing I can remember about it was the controversy that surrounded it at release, because everybody said it was racist because it took place in Africa. As sad as it is, and as diehard of a fan of the series as I am, without looking it up, I couldn't tell you what went on in that game, except that you find a stupid flower that caused all the trouble because that was the source of the T virus or something along those lines. Okay, but that's it. It's a backstory, but it's not even really the backstory because all the crap already happened. You're just trying to figure it out. It doesn't further the series at all. But again, technically, it was a good game. I really enjoyed the co-op mode. Me and my brother used to play all the time, and it felt like at that point that they were still trying. Yeah, we're trying to figure out how we're going to bring this meticulous, plotting kind of game style into the next generation and capture a new fan base while still retaining our old fan base. And in some ways it succeeded, but in more ways, in my personal opinion, it failed. And aside from the lack of storyline and the furthering of the series in Resident Evil 5, I enjoyed it. I'll say that much about it. However, the game that just makes me mad is Resident Evil 6. Now, to this day, Resident Evil 6 is the only Resident Evil game that I have not beaten. I beat Leon's campaign, and, I'll say this, I enjoyed it somewhat, because it was the closest to being a Resident Evil game, at least in the beginning, that I had ever played. Short of Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, and, the others, with the exception of 4 and 5. However, at some point in the game where I'm doing stupid QuickTime events to fly a helicopter around China, I kind of had this moment of reflection where I'm sitting there like, what the hell is even going on? I am a die-hard fan of this series. I have beaten every single game up to this point, and I don't understand what's going on. We have a problem. The Resident Evil story has gotten completely out of control, almost worse than the movies, which I pretty much refuse to acknowledge exist. But suffice it to say, Resident Evil 6 was punishment. That game felt like homework. It never freaking ended. You know, the logical conclusion points, oh, it's something else, it's something else. And just to get from point A to point B, it felt more like I was playing Gears of War than I was a Resident Evil game. And that, to me, is inexcusable. And I know critics have come out and panned the game, and most Resident Evil fans hated it almost universally. Now, that's not to say everything about it was bad. It sucked. And I say that from the bottom of my gamer heart. What little is left after it's been ripped out by so many bad sequels, especially this one, that it just breaks my heart to see and play the Resident Evil Remaster and to think what these games could have been if more time was spent developing games like that than Gears of War Light or Call of Duty Light, which is essentially what Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 are. Again, technically, not terrible games, although the camera in Resident Evil sucks. They're just not Resident Evil games to me. And so I started sitting down and talking with one of my buddies who's also a Resident Evil diehard fan, trying to figure out what it is they're going to do with 7. And at this point, I have no idea. I don't know if they're going to try to recapture that old school game style, or if they're going to go and create another action movie. I don't know. But with all that being said, in preparation for Resident Evil 7, whenever it does come out, I am going to start a Let's Play series, and we're going to get through every single Resident Evil game, and I will finally conquer the monster that is Resident Evil 6. I will do everything in my power to beat it. So stay tuned. We should get the Let's Play series started with Resident Evil, and I'm talking Resident Evil on the PlayStation, the original, the badass that started it all. Stay tuned.